Sarah Mitchell had always been a nervous flyer, but exhaustion won over anxiety as Flight 447 lifted off from Denver International Airport at 11:30 p.m. The red-eye flight to Boston was packed with business travelers, families returning from vacations, and college students heading back to school. Sarah clutched her boarding pass one last time before settling into seat 12C, grateful for the window seat that would let her lean against the wall and hopefully catch a few hours of sleep. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration with practiced efficiency, while Sarah pulled out her noise-canceling headphones and eye mask. She had been working 18-hour days for the past 3 weeks, preparing for a crucial presentation that could determine her company's future. The merger talks in Boston were make or break, and as the lead negotiator, everything depended on her being sharp and ready. Captain Robert Hayes announced their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet as Sarah drifted off to sleep. The gentle hum of the engines and the darkened cabin created the perfect environment for rest. Around her, other passengers, settled in with books, laptops, or their own attempts at sleep. A businessman in 12A was already snoring softly, while a young mother in 12B tried to keep her toddler entertained with quiet toys. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the plains of Kansas, Captain Hayes was reviewing the weather reports with his first officer, Michael Chen, when he felt the first wave of dizziness. At 58, Hayes had been flying commercial aircraft for over 30 years without a single major incident. He had logged more than 20,000 flight hours and was known among his colleagues for his calm demeanor and exceptional skill in handling difficult situations. The dizziness passed quickly, and Hayes attributed it to the strong coffee he had consumed during his pre-flight preparation. He had been feeling slightly under the weather for the past few days, but nothing that seemed serious enough to ground himself. In the aviation industry, pilots learned to push through minor discomfort, especially when passengers were counting on them to get home safely. First Officer Chen noticed his captain rubbing his temples and asked if everything was all right. Hayes assured him it was just a minor headache and suggested Chen take over communications with air traffic control for a while. This was standard procedure and nothing that raised any red flags for the experienced first officer. As the aircraft continued its steady eastward journey, Hayes found himself struggling to focus on the instrument panel. The numbers seemed to blur together, and he felt an unusual tightness in his chest. His medical training from decades of aviation physiology courses told him these could be warning signs of something more serious, but his dedication to duty and the 147 passengers behind him made him hesitant to create what might be unnecessary alarm. The cabin remained peaceful, with most passengers sleeping or quietly occupied with their personal activities. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh made her routine walk through the aisles, checking on passengers and ensuring everyone was comfortable. She noticed Sarah sleeping soundly in row 12, her presentation materials scattered on the tray table beside her. Jennifer quietly moved the papers to ensure they wouldn't fall during any potential turbulence. Sarah's dreams were filled with conference rooms, charts, and the faces of executives who held her company's fate in their hands. In her subconscious, she was rehearsing her opening statement, going over the financial projections that she had memorized down to the last decimal point. Her career had been built on preparation and attention to detail, qualities that had earned her respect in the male-dominated world of corporate finance. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hayes was beginning to experience more concerning symptoms. His vision was becoming increasingly blurred, and he felt a strange numbness in his left arm. Years of medical training for pilots had taught him to recognize the potential signs of a cardiac event, but the timing couldn't have been worse. They were in the middle of one of the busiest air corridors in the country, with multiple aircraft above and below them. First Officer Chen was handling the radio communications when he noticed Hayes slumping slightly in his seat. The captain's breathing had become labored, and small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the cockpit. Chen's training immediately kicked in as he recognized the signs of a medical emergency. Hayes tried to maintain his composure, knowing that panic in the cockpit could quickly spread to the rest of the crew and potentially the passengers. He attempted to continue his duties, but his hands were shaking as he reached for the controls. The weight of responsibility for 147 lives pressed down on him as he realized he might not be able to continue flying. The aircraft maintained its steady course at 37,000 feet, the autopilot system handling the navigation while the human drama unfolded in the cockpit. Air traffic controllers in Kansas City continued their routine communications with various flights in their sector, unaware that Flight 447 was about to become their most challenging situation of the night. Sarah stirred, briefly in her sleep, unconsciously adjusting her position against the window. The businessman beside her had stopped snoring and was now deeply asleep, while the young mother had finally managed to get her toddler to drift off. The peaceful scene in the cabin stood in stark contrast to the growing crisis just 30 feet away in the cockpit. First Officer Chen made the difficult decision to contact the lead flight attendant, using the interphone system to request her immediate presence in the cockpit. His training had prepared him for this moment, but the reality of potentially losing his captain mid-flight was something no amount of simulation could fully prepare him for. As he waited for Jennifer Walsh to arrive, he said a silent prayer that his captain would recover and that they would land safely in Boston as planned. The night sky around them remained calm and clear, with stars visible through the cockpit windows. Other aircraft passed by at safe distances, their navigation, lights blinking in the darkness like distant fireflies. None of their pilots could have imagined that Flight 447 was about to become the center of one of the most dramatic aviation stories of the year. Captain Hayes looked at his first officer with eyes that conveyed both determination and fear. He knew that the next few minutes would determine not only his own fate, but the safety of everyone aboard the aircraft. The weight of command had never felt heavier as he prepared to make decisions that would test every aspect of his training and experience. Jennifer Walsh knocked softly on the cockpit door, using the special code that identified her as the lead flight attendant. When First Officer Chen opened the door, she immediately noticed the tension in his face and the way Captain Hayes was gripping his chest. Her 12 years of flight experience had taught her to read situations quickly, and she knew this was not a routine call. Chen quietly explained that the captain was experiencing what appeared to be chest pains and difficulty breathing. Hayes, despite his obvious discomfort, tried to downplay the situation, insisting he could continue flying. However, the medical protocols were clear. Any sign of cardiac distress required immediate action, especially at 37,000 feet with 147 passengers depending on their judgment. Walsh knew the emergency procedures by heart, but she had never expected to use them in a real situation. Her training kicked in as she assessed the captain's condition. His color had turned pale and he was sweating despite the cool cockpit temperature. She had seen enough medical emergencies during her career to recognize that this was serious and potentially life-threatening. The first priority was ensuring the aircraft remained under control. First Officer Chen was fully qualified to fly the plane, but having a single pilot for the remainder of the flight to Boston was not ideal, especially if they encountered weather or other complications. The backup plan was to divert to the nearest suitable airport, but that would mean waking passengers and creating potential panic. Captain Hayes attempted to radio air traffic control himself, but his voice was weak and strained. Chen took over communications, informing Kansas City Center that they had a medical emergency and might need priority handling. The air traffic controller, a 20-year veteran named Tom Rodriguez, immediately cleared the airspace around Flight 447 and began coordinating with emergency services. In the cabin, most passengers remained unaware of the developing crisis. Sarah continued sleeping peacefully in row 12, her presentation materials still scattered around her seat. A few passengers noticed that the flight attendant seemed more active than usual, moving quickly through the aisles and speaking in hushed tones, but nothing seemed alarming enough to cause concern. Flight attendant Walsh made a crucial decision to check if there were any medical professionals aboard the aircraft. She quietly moved through the cabin, discreetly asking passengers about their professions. In row 8, she found Dr. Amanda Foster, an emergency room physician returning from a medical conference in Denver. Dr. Foster immediately agreed to examine the captain. The examination in the cramped cockpit confirmed Walsh's fears. Captain Hayes was showing classic signs of a heart attack, chest pain radiating to his left arm, difficulty breathing, and an irregular pulse. Dr. Foster recommended immediate medical attention and questioned whether Hayes should continue piloting the aircraft. The decision was made to have the captain step down from his duties, leaving First Officer Chen as the sole pilot. Chen had thousands of flight hours and was perfectly qualified to land the aircraft safely, but the airline's safety protocols preferred having two pilots in the cockpit during critical phases of flight. Walsh knew there was one more option that airlines rarely had to consider: finding a qualified pilot among the passengers who could serve as an emergency backup. She returned to the cabin and began discreetly asking passengers about aviation experience. Most people had no flying background beyond being passengers, but in row 23, she found retired Air Force Colonel James Morrison, who had flown military transport aircraft for 25 years before becoming a civilian instructor, pilot. However, Morrison had been drinking alcohol during the flight and was not in condition to serve as emergency backup. The search continued as the aircraft flew steadily eastward. In row 31, Walsh discovered retired commercial pilot Robert Turner, who had flown for a major airline for 30 years before retiring just 6 months earlier. Turner was completely sober and immediately agreed to help when he understood the situation. His experience flying the same type of aircraft gave everyone confidence that they had found their emergency backup. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes's condition was deteriorating. Dr. Foster had given him aspirin and was monitoring his vital signs, but she strongly recommended diverting to the nearest airport with medical facilities. The closest option was Kansas City International Airport, about 40 minutes away, but First Officer Chen was concerned about the weather conditions there and preferred continuing to their planned destination in Boston, where the medical facilities were better. Air traffic control was now fully aware of the situation and had begun coordinating with multiple emergency services. Ambulances were being dispatched to both Kansas City and Boston Logan International Airport, depending on the crew's final decision. The controllers also began clearing airspace to give Flight 447 priority handling for whatever course of action they chose. Turner made his way to the cockpit and was briefed on the aircraft's current status. Although he was familiar with the plane systems, it had been 6 months since he had flown professionally, and the specific airline's procedures were slightly different from his previous employer. However, his presence provided crucial backup support for First Officer Chen and gave everyone greater confidence in their ability to handle the emergency. Sarah stirred in her sleep as the aircraft made a slight course adjustment. The change in engine noise was subtle, but her subconscious mind detected the difference. She opened her eyes briefly, looked around the darkened cabin, and noticed that several flight attendants were moving about more actively than usual during a typical red-eye flight. However, her exhaustion overcame her curiosity and she closed her eyes again, assuming they were simply preparing for the approach to Boston. The businessman in seat 12A woke up when he heard increased activity in the cabin. He noticed flight attendants speaking in hushed tones and moving with what seemed like greater urgency than normal. When he asked a passing attendant if everything was all right, she assured him that everything was under control and suggested he try to get more rest. Captain Hayes was now clearly unable to perform his duties. His chest pain had intensified, and Dr. Foster was concerned about potential complications. The decision was made to remove him from the cockpit entirely and have him rest in a first-class seat where Dr. Foster could continue monitoring his condition. This left First Officer Chen in command of the aircraft with retired pilot Turner serving as his backup. The cockpit now had a new dynamic with Chen as the primary pilot and Turner providing support and guidance. Although both men were experienced aviators, they had never worked together before, and the emergency situation added stress to their coordination. They spent time reviewing the aircraft systems and discussing the approach procedures for Boston Logan International Airport. Air traffic controllers continued clearing the path ahead of Flight 447, ensuring they would have priority landing rights when they reached Boston. Emergency medical services were being coordinated at Logan Airport, with ambulances and medical teams standing by for Captain Hayes. The situation had evolved from a routine red-eye flight to a full-scale medical emergency, but the professionalism of everyone involved kept panic from spreading through the cabin. As the aircraft continued eastward, the first hints of dawn began appearing on the horizon. The peaceful sunrise stood in stark contrast to the medical crisis. that had unfolded during the night. In just a few hours, Flight 447 would need to execute a safe landing with a substitute crew, while ensuring that Captain Hayes received the medical attention that could save his life. First Officer Chen took a deep breath as he settled into the captain's seat, a position he had occupied countless times during training, but never under these circumstances. The weight of responsibility for 147 lives felt heavier than ever as he adjusted the seat and familiarized himself with the primary flight controls. Beside him, retired pilot Robert Turner was quickly reviewing the flight management system and backup procedures. Dr. Foster had Captain Hayes resting in seat 2A, where she could monitor his condition while remaining close enough to the cockpit to provide updates. Hayes was conscious but weak, and his color had improved slightly after taking the aspirin. However, Dr. Foster remained concerned about potential complications and strongly recommended that they maintain their course to Boston, where better cardiac facilities were available. The aircraft was now flying over Missouri, with approximately 2 hours remaining until their scheduled arrival in Boston. Air traffic control had been notified of their situation and was providing priority routing to ensure the smoothest possible flight path. The controllers in multiple sectors were coordinating to clear other aircraft from their path and provide direct routing to minimize flight time. Turner spent the first 30 minutes reviewing the aircraft systems and procedures manual. Although he had flown similar aircraft for decades, each airline had specific procedures and emergency protocols that required familiarity. His experience was invaluable, but he needed to understand the exact configurations and checklists that this particular airline used for emergency situations. In the cabin, Flight Attendant Walsh made the decision to inform the other crew members about the situation without creating panic among passengers. The flight attendants needed to be prepared for potential medical emergencies or unusual procedures during landing, but they also needed to maintain the calm atmosphere that would keep passengers comfortable and unaware of the crisis. Sarah continued, sleeping in row 12, occasionally shifting position but remaining largely undisturbed by the increased activity around her. Her presentation materials had been secured by Flight Attendant Walsh earlier, and her laptop bag was safely stowed under the seat in front of her. The merger talks that awaited her in Boston seemed insignificant compared to the life and death drama unfolding just 30 feet away from her seat. A few passengers had begun to notice the unusual level of activity among the crew. The businessman in 12A asked another flight attendant why there seemed to be so much movement in the cabin during what should have been a quiet period of the flight. He was told that the crew was conducting routine safety checks and preparing for the approach to Boston, which was technically true but didn't reveal the full scope of the situation. Turner's presence in the cockpit provided Chen with the confidence boost he needed. Having another experienced pilot review his decisions and procedures was invaluable, especially as they began planning for the approach and landing at Logan International Airport. Turner's 3 decades of commercial flying experience included numerous emergency situations, though none quite like this one. The 2 pilots spent considerable time reviewing the weather conditions at Boston Logan. A front was moving through the area, bringing moderate winds and some turbulence, but nothing that should complicate a normal landing. However, they wanted to ensure they had contingency plans in case conditions deteriorated or if they encountered any mechanical issues that would compound their current medical emergency. Dr. Foster made regular trips between Captain Hayes and the cockpit, providing updates on his condition. His vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but she remained concerned about the possibility of another cardiac event. The high altitude and stress of the situation were not ideal for someone experiencing heart problems, but continuing to Boston remained the best option for getting him proper medical care. Air traffic control began coordinating with Boston Logan's emergency services. Ambulances, fire trucks, and medical teams were being positioned near the runway to provide immediate assistance upon landing. The airport's medical facilities were also being notified to prepare for a cardiac patient who would need immediate attention upon arrival. Chen began his descent planning earlier than usual, wanting to ensure a smooth and gradual approach that would minimize stress on both the aircraft systems and Captain Hayes. The descent would begin over New York State and continue gradually until they reached the Boston area. This conservative approach would provide additional time to handle any unexpected situations that might arise. Turner reviewed the airline's specific procedures for medical emergencies and emergency landings. Although their situation didn't technically require an emergency landing, the aircraft was functioning normally. They would receive priority handling, and emergency services would be standing by. This meant coordinating with multiple agencies and ensuring all safety protocols were followed precisely. The young mother in row 12B noticed that her toddler seemed more restless than usual. Children often sense tension in the environment even when they can't understand what's happening. She tried to keep him occupied with quiet toys and books, but he seemed to pick up on the subtle changes in the cabin atmosphere that adults were beginning to notice. Flight attendant Walsh made another discreet check of the passenger manifest to ensure she hadn't missed any medical professionals who might be able to assist Dr. Foster. She found a nurse in row 18 and quietly informed her of the situation, asking her to be available if needed. The nurse, Patricia Collins, immediately agreed to help and positioned herself where she could quickly reach the front of the aircraft if necessary. As they crossed into New York airspace, Chen received updated weather information for Boston Logan. Conditions remained acceptable for landing, with winds at 15 knots and visibility good despite some scattered clouds. The runway configuration would allow for a straight-in approach, which was ideal for their situation since it would minimize maneuvering and provide the most direct path to the gate. Turner suggested they brief the flight attendants on the planned approach so they could prepare the cabin appropriately. Although they didn't want to alarm passengers, the crew needed to be ready for a potentially expedited taxi to the gate and immediate medical assistance for Captain Hayes. This meant ensuring all passengers were properly seated and secured for landing earlier than normal. Captain Hayes remained conscious and was able to communicate with Dr. Foster, though his voice was weak. He expressed concern for his passengers and crew, asking repeatedly whether the flight was proceeding safely. Dr. Foster assured him that everything was under control and encouraged him to focus on resting and conserving his strength for the medical treatment he would receive in Boston. The aircraft's navigation systems showed they were making good time despite the medical emergency. The flight management system calculated an arrival time only 15 minutes later than originally scheduled, thanks to the priority routing provided by air traffic control. This efficiency meant that Captain Hayes would receive medical attention sooner, and passengers would reach their destination with minimal delay. Chen felt the pressure of command as he prepared for what would likely be the most important landing of his career. Every decision he made would be scrutinized later, but more importantly, the safety of everyone aboard depended on his skill and judgment. The presence of Turner provided reassurance, but ultimately the responsibility for the aircraft and its passengers rested with him as the pilot in command. Sarah stirred again as the aircraft began its initial descent, the change in cabin pressure causing her ears to pop slightly. She opened her eyes and noticed that the sky outside her window was beginning to show the first light of dawn. Boston was still more than an hour away, but the gradual descent had begun, and she assumed this was normal procedure for their arrival. As Flight 447 crossed into Massachusetts airspace, the morning sun began painting the eastern horizon with shades of orange and pink. The beautiful sunrise provided a stark contrast to the tension that had been building throughout the night. Chen maintained radio contact with Boston Approach Control, who had been briefed on their medical emergency and were providing vectors for a direct approach to runway 4R. Captain Hayes's condition had remained stable for the past hour, but Dr. Foster continued monitoring his vital signs closely. His blood pressure was elevated, and she was concerned about the stress that the approach and landing might place on his cardiovascular system. She had done everything possible with the limited medical supplies available on the aircraft, but he needed advanced cardiac care as soon as possible. Turner was proving invaluable as he helped Chen review the approach procedures and backup plans. His experience with emergency situations provided a calming influence in the cockpit, and his knowledge of Boston Logan's layout helped them plan the most efficient taxi route to the gate where medical personnel would be waiting. The coordination between the two pilots was working smoothly, despite them never having flown together before. In the cabin, more passengers were beginning to wake up as the morning light filtered through the windows. Sarah opened her eyes and checked her watch, pleased to see they were still on schedule for her important presentation. She had no idea that the quiet professional crew work happening around her was actually a carefully orchestrated response to a medical emergency that could have compromised the entire flight. Flight attendant Walsh made a subtle announcement, asking passengers to ensure their seatbelts were fastened and seats upright as they began their descent into Boston. She maintained a calm, professional tone that gave no indication of the crisis that had unfolded during the night. Her years of training had prepared her to handle emergencies while keeping passengers calm and confident in the crew's ability to manage the situation. The businessman in seat 12A finally woke up fully and noticed the increased activity among the flight crew. He observed that they seemed more focused and professional than usual, moving with purpose through their duties. When he asked about the unusual level of attention to detail, a flight attendant explained that they were conducting additional safety checks due to weather conditions in Boston, which was a partial truth that satisfied his curiosity without revealing the medical emergency. Boston Approach Control provided Flight 447 with vectors that would bring them directly to the airport, without the usual holding patterns or delays. The controllers had coordinated with other aircraft to clear their path, and were treating the flight as a priority due to the medical emergency. This meant they would land ahead of several other flights and receive immediate gate access. Chen began configuring the aircraft for landing, extending flaps and landing gear according to the standard procedures he had performed thousands of times before. However, the knowledge that Captain Hayes was fighting for his life in the cabin behind him added weight to every decision. Turner double-checked each configuration change, providing the backup verification that normally would have come from Hayes. Dr. Foster made another assessment of Captain Hayes and found his condition largely unchanged. He remained conscious and alert, though obviously in discomfort. His color had improved slightly since taking the aspirin, and his breathing seemed less labored than it had been earlier in the flight. However, she knew that heart attack symptoms could change rapidly, and the stress of landing could trigger additional complications. The nurse, Patricia Collins, had positioned herself in row 3, where she could quickly assist Dr. Foster if needed during the approach and landing. She had reviewed the aircraft's medical supplies and was prepared to help with anything that might arise during the final phase of the flight. Her presence provided additional medical expertise that could prove crucial if Hayes's condition deteriorated. Air traffic control at Boston Logan had coordinated with the airport's emergency services to have medical personnel standing by at the gate. An ambulance, paramedics, and a cardiac specialist from Massachusetts General Hospital were being positioned to provide immediate care for Captain Hayes. The airport's operations center was also coordinating to ensure the aircraft would receive priority gate access and ground support. Turner reviewed the airline's procedures for emergency medical situations and confirmed that all protocols were being followed correctly. The documentation would be important later, but more immediately, following proper procedures ensured that nothing was overlooked that could compromise Hayes's medical care or the safety of the passengers. As they descended through 10,000 feet, Chen felt the familiar sensations of approaching home base. He had landed at Boston Logan hundreds of times, but never under circumstances like these. The runway appeared clear ahead, and weather conditions remained favorable for a normal approach and landing. Everything seemed to be falling into place for a successful conclusion to their emergency. Sarah gathered her presentation materials and began organizing them for her meeting later that morning. The merger negotiations would begin in just a few hours, and she needed to be sharp and prepared. She had no way of knowing that the smooth, professional handling of their flight had involved a medical emergency that tested the skills and training of the entire crew. The young mother in row 12B was trying to keep her toddler calm as the aircraft descended and his ears began to bother him. The child seemed to sense the tension that some adults were beginning to notice, even though the crew had managed to keep the situation from becoming obvious to most passengers. She gave him a bottle to help with the pressure changes and tried to keep him entertained with quiet toys. Captain Hayes asked Dr. Foster about the flight's progress, and she was able to tell him that they were approaching Boston and would be landing soon. He expressed relief that his passengers and crew had not been endangered by his medical emergency, though he remained concerned about the stress his condition might have placed on First Officer Chen. His dedication to safety and passenger welfare remained strong even while dealing with his own crisis. Chen received clearance from Boston Tower to land on runway 4R, with emergency vehicles standing by as a precautionary measure. The landing would be routine from a technical standpoint, but the knowledge that ambulances and medical personnel were waiting added gravity to the moment. He had successfully managed a medical emergency while maintaining the safety and comfort of his passengers. Turner prepared for landing by reviewing emergency procedures one final time, ensuring they were ready for any unexpected situations that might arise during the final approach. His presence in the cockpit had provided crucial backup support for Chen, and his experience had helped maintain the professional calm that kept the situation from escalating into panic. The aircraft crossed the outer marker for runway 4R, and Chen began the final approach phase. The landing would mark the end of a night that had tested everyone involved, from the flight crew who managed the emergency to the medical professionals who provided care to Captain Hayes. In a few minutes, Flight 447 would safely deliver its passengers to Boston, and Hayes would receive the advanced cardiac care that could save his life. Dr. Foster prepared for landing by ensuring Captain Hayes was as comfortable and stable as possible. The approach phase could be stressful for someone with cardiac problems, so she monitored his vital signs closely and was ready to provide additional medical intervention if needed. Her quick thinking and professional medical care had been crucial in managing Hayes' condition throughout the emergency. The runway lights of Boston Logan International Airport appeared through the morning haze as Flight 447 made its final approach. Chen had executed hundreds of landings, but never with such high stakes. The aircraft was configured properly, speed was on target, and the approach path was stable. Behind him, 147 passengers trusted in his ability to bring them safely to the ground, while Captain Hayes fought to remain conscious in the first-class cabin. Dr. Foster kept one hand on Hayes' wrist, monitoring his pulse during the descent. His heart rate had increased with the stress of landing, but remained within acceptable limits. She had given him oxygen from the aircraft's portable supply, which seemed to help his breathing. The next few minutes would be critical, as the physical stress of landing could potentially trigger another cardiac episode. Turner called out altitude and airspeed readings to Chen, providing the backup that Captain Hayes would normally have given. Their coordination was seamless despite having never flown together before. Turner's 3 decades of commercial aviation experience showed in his calm professionalism and precise communication. He monitored the instruments while Chen focused on the visual approach to the runway. Sarah looked out her window as the familiar Boston skyline came into view. She felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about the day ahead. The merger talks would determine not only her company's future, but potentially her own career trajectory. She had prepared extensively, but corporate negotiations at this level always carried an element of unpredictability. She gathered her materials and prepared for what she hoped would be a successful day. The aircraft touched down smoothly on runway 4R at 6:47 a.m., just 18 minutes behind their original scheduled arrival time. Chen felt the satisfaction of a well-executed landing, but his focus immediately shifted to getting the aircraft safely to the gate, where medical personnel were waiting. The emergency vehicles that had been standing by began following the aircraft as it taxied toward the terminal. Captain Hayes remained conscious during the landing, though Dr. Foster could see that the stress was taking its toll. His color had paled again, and he was gripping the armrest tightly. She continued monitoring his vital signs and reassuring him that medical help was just minutes away. Her calm presence had been crucial throughout the emergency, providing professional medical care at 37,000 feet. Flight attendant Walsh made an announcement asking passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened until the aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate. She maintained the same professional tone she had used throughout the flight, giving no indication to the passengers that they had just experienced one of the most dramatic medical emergencies in aviation. Her crew management had been flawless, under pressure. The businessman in seat 12A noticed the emergency vehicles following their aircraft as they taxied to the gate. He asked a flight attendant about them and was told they were conducting a routine drill, which was a plausible explanation that satisfied his curiosity without revealing the true nature of the emergency. The crew's ability to maintain passenger confidence throughout the crisis had been remarkable. Ground control directed Flight 447 to Gate B12, where paramedics and a cardiac specialist were waiting. The airport's operations team had coordinated to ensure the jet bridge would be positioned immediately, and that medical personnel could board the aircraft as soon as it stopped. This level of coordination demonstrated the aviation industry's ability to respond effectively to in-flight medical emergencies. As the aircraft approached the gate, Chen felt the weight of command beginning to lift. He had successfully managed a medical emergency while maintaining the safety and comfort of his passengers. The landing had been smooth, and Captain Hayes had remained stable throughout the approach. In a few minutes, Hayes would receive the advanced medical care that could save his life. Turner helped Chen complete the shutdown checklists as they arrived at the gate. His assistance had been invaluable throughout the emergency, providing the backup pilot support that had allowed Chen to focus on flying the aircraft safely. The retired pilot's willingness to help in an emergency situation exemplified the aviation community's commitment to safety and mutual support. Dr. Foster prepared Captain Hayes for the handoff to the medical team that would be boarding the aircraft. She had compiled notes on his condition, the medications given, and the timeline of symptoms that would be crucial for the emergency room physicians. Her documentation and care had been thorough despite the challenging environment of an aircraft cabin. Sarah stood up and gathered her belongings as the aircraft reached the gate. She noticed that the crew seemed to be handling some kind of priority situation in the first-class section, but assumed it was routine passenger assistance. Her focus was on the day ahead and the presentation that would begin in just a few hours. She had no idea she had been part of an aviation emergency that would be talked about for years. The jet bridge connected to the aircraft, and paramedics immediately boarded with their equipment. Dr. Foster briefed them on Captain Hayes' condition, while they began their assessment and prepared him for transport to Massachusetts General Hospital. The transition from aircraft medical care to professional emergency services was smooth and efficient. Passengers began deplaning normally, with most unaware that they had just experienced a significant aviation emergency. The crew's professionalism had kept the situation calm throughout the night, allowing what could have been a panicked emergency to be handled with dignity and efficiency. The aviation industry's training and protocols had worked exactly as designed. Chen remained in the Cockpit, completing paperwork and coordinating with company officials who had been notified of the emergency. He would need to provide detailed reports on the incident and undergo medical evaluation himself, as required by aviation regulations after any in-flight emergency. His handling of the situation would be reviewed and likely commended by the airline. Captain Hayes was conscious and alert as the paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital. He asked about his passengers and crew one final time, and was assured that everyone had landed safely, and that the aircraft had suffered no damage or complications from the emergency. His dedication to safety and passenger welfare had remained strong even during his own medical crisis. Turner gathered his belongings and prepared to continue his journey as a passenger. His willingness to help during the emergency had been crucial to the successful outcome. The aviation community's tradition of pilots helping pilots in emergencies had once again proven its value. He would submit a report to the airline detailing his assistance and observations during the incident. Sarah walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal, already focused on her upcoming presentation. She checked her phone for messages and confirmed her transportation to the downtown hotel, where the merger talks would take place. The smooth handling of their flight had allowed her to get the rest she needed, and she felt prepared for the challenging day ahead. The emergency response at Boston Logan had been coordinated perfectly, with medical personnel, ground crews, and airport operations all working together to ensure Captain Hayes received immediate care. The success of the emergency response demonstrated the aviation industry's commitment to safety and the effectiveness of established protocols for handling in-flight medical emergencies. As Hayes was transported to the ambulance, Dr. Foster felt satisfied that she had done everything possible under the circumstances. Her quick recognition of the cardiac symptoms and professional medical care had potentially saved his life. The portable medical equipment on the aircraft had been adequate for managing his condition until they could reach advanced care facilities. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the same Boston hotel where her merger presentation had taken place successfully that morning in August. The deal had gone through, saving her company and securing her position as Vice President of Strategic Development. But today she wasn't here for business. She was attending a celebration that had nothing to do with corporate mergers and everything to do with the quiet heroism that had unfolded around her while she slept peacefully in row 12. Captain Robert Hayes looked remarkably healthy as he greeted guests at the airline's recognition ceremony. The triple bypass surgery he had undergone at Massachusetts General Hospital had been successful, and months of cardiac rehabilitation had restored him to better health than he had enjoyed in years. His cardiologist had told him that Dr. Foster's quick recognition and treatment during the flight had likely saved his life by preventing a more massive heart attack. The airline had organized this gathering to recognize the crew and passengers who had responded to the medical emergency with such professionalism and courage. Sarah had been invited as one of the passengers aboard Flight 447, though she was still amazed to learn about the drama that had occurred while she slept. The invitation letter had been her first indication that her red-eye flight had been anything but routine. First Officer Michael Chen, now Captain Chen after his promotion following the incident, stood beside Hayes as they welcomed the gathered crowd. His handling of the emergency had been reviewed extensively by the airline and federal aviation authorities, and he had received commendations for his professional competence under extraordinary circumstances. The promotion to captain had come with the recognition that he had proven himself capable of command during the most challenging situations. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived with her family, having traveled from Denver for the ceremony. Her emergency medical intervention at 37,000 feet had become a case study taught in both aviation medicine and emergency response courses. She had received recognition from both medical and aviation organizations for her life-saving actions during the flight. Her quick thinking and professional care had bridged the gap between the aircraft's limited medical capabilities and advanced cardiac care. Retired pilot Robert Turner was there with his wife, still modest about his contribution to the successful emergency response. His willingness to step forward and assist during the crisis exemplified the aviation community's tradition of mutual support. The airline had offered him consulting opportunities based on his experience managing emergency situations, though he remained content with his retirement and occasional flight instruction. Lead flight attendant Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to supervisor of emergency response training, using her experience from Flight 447 to improve the airline's procedures for handling medical emergencies. Her calm leadership during the crisis had kept passengers unaware of the danger, while coordinating the complex response that had saved Hayes' life. She now traveled to training centers across the country, sharing her experience with other flight crews. The businessman from Seat 12A, David Richardson, attended the ceremony with his family. He had learned about the emergency only when the airline contacted him months later as part of their passenger outreach following the incident. His reaction was typical of most passengers, amazement that such a serious situation had been handled so professionally that they remained unaware of any danger. Sarah found herself fascinated by the stories she heard from other crew members and passengers. The young mother from Seat 12B, Lisa Chen, had brought her toddler, now walking and chattering constantly. She admitted that she had sensed something unusual was happening during the flight but had attributed it to her child's restlessness. Learning about the medical emergency had given her even greater appreciation for the professionalism of airline crews. Nurse Patricia Collins, who had positioned herself to assist Dr. Foster during the emergency, had used her experience from Flight 447 to advocate for better medical training for flight attendants. Her recommendations had been incorporated into the airline's updated emergency medical procedures, potentially saving lives on future flights where medical professionals might not be available among the passengers. Captain Hayes spoke to the gathered crowd about his gratitude to everyone who had contributed to saving his life. He described waking up in the intensive care unit at Massachusetts General Hospital and learning about the chain of professional responses that had brought him safely to medical care. His voice remained strong, despite the emotional weight of thanking people who had literally saved his life. The airline's chief pilot presented awards to Chen, Turner, Walsh, and Dr. Foster, recognizing their exceptional performance during the emergency. The ceremony highlighted not just their individual contributions, but also the importance of the aviation industry's safety culture, where extensive training and clear procedures enable crews to handle even the most unexpected situations with competence and calm. Hayes had returned to flying after his recovery, though with restrictions that required regular medical monitoring. His experience had made him an advocate for pilot health awareness and early intervention for cardiovascular symptoms. He spoke regularly at aviation safety conferences about the importance of recognizing medical emergencies and the value of crew resource management in crisis situations. Dr. Foster had collaborated with aviation medical researchers to study in-flight cardiac emergencies and improve the medical equipment available on commercial aircraft. Her recommendations had led to upgrades in emergency medical supplies and better training for flight crews in recognizing and responding to cardiac events. Her experience on Flight 447 had contributed to safer air travel for millions of passengers. Sarah reflected on how she had slept peacefully through an emergency that could have ended tragically without the professional competence of the crew and the willingness of passengers to help. Her successful merger presentation that morning had seemed like the most important thing in the world, but she now understood that the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under pressure was far more significant. The ceremony concluded with Hayes presenting small gifts to each person who had contributed to the successful emergency response. Sarah received a framed photograph of Flight 447 with a note thanking her for being part of a story that demonstrated the best of human nature under pressure. She realized that sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen while we're not even aware of them. Turner mentioned in his brief speech that aviation emergencies often bring out the best in people, creating temporary communities bound together by shared challenges and mutual support. Flight 447 had become such a community, with passengers and crew members maintaining friendships that had grown from their shared experience of a night when professional training and human compassion had combined to save a life. As the evening ended, Sarah understood that she had been part of something much larger than a routine flight from Denver to Boston. She had witnessed, even unconsciously, the aviation industry's safety culture in action, where extensive training, clear procedures, and individual courage combined to handle even the most serious emergencies with competence and dignity. The story of Flight 447 had become part of aviation history, studied in training programs and safety courses, as an example of how proper procedures and professional competence can turn a potential tragedy into a successful emergency response. Captain Hayes continued flying, Dr. Foster continued practicing emergency medicine, and Sarah continued her corporate career, but they were all forever connected by a night when ordinary people did extraordinary things at 37,000 feet above the sleeping countryside. Hayes had established a foundation to support aviation medical research and pilot health awareness programs. His near-death experience had given him a new perspective on life and a commitment to improving safety for future generations of pilots and passengers. The foundation provided grants for research into in-flight medical emergencies and supported training programs for aviation medical response. Dr. Foster had written several medical journal articles about in-flight cardiac care and had become a consultant for airlines developing improved medical protocols. Her experience treating a heart attack at cruising altitude had provided valuable insights into the challenges of emergency medicine in aircraft environments. She regularly lectured at medical schools about the unique aspects of providing care in confined spaces with limited equipment. Chen had become an instructor pilot, training new captains in emergency procedures and crew resource management. His experience managing the medical emergency while maintaining flight safety had made him a valuable resource for pilots learning to handle crisis situations. He often told the story of Flight 447 to illustrate how proper training and calm decision-making could overcome even the most unexpected challenges. Walsh had developed new training protocols for flight attendants that emphasized the importance of passenger awareness and resource identification during emergencies. Her procedures for discreetly locating medical professionals and qualified pilots among passengers had been adopted by airlines worldwide. She had turned her experience into a training program that could potentially save lives on future flights. Turner had come out of retirement to work part-time as an emergency response consultant for the airline. His experience stepping forward to help during the Flight 447 crisis had demonstrated the value of maintaining connections with retired pilots who could provide expertise during unusual situations. He had helped develop procedures for identifying and utilizing qualified passengers during emergencies. The recognition ceremony had brought together people whose lives had intersected for just a few hours but who had created lasting bonds through their shared experience. The aviation industry's emphasis on safety and professional competence had been demonstrated in the most practical way possible, through the successful management of a life-threatening emergency that could have ended in tragedy. Sarah kept the framed photograph of Flight 447 on her office desk as a reminder that heroism often happens quietly, performed by professionals doing their jobs with dedication and skill. The merger she had negotiated that morning had been important for her career, but the medical emergency that had unfolded around her sleeping form had been a matter of life and death for Captain Hayes. Hayes had made a full recovery and returned to flying with a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of the aviation safety systems that had protected him and his passengers. His experience had reinforced his belief in the value of training, procedures, and the willingness of individuals to step forward during emergencies. The story of Flight 447 continued to be told in aviation training centers, medical schools, and emergency response courses around the world. It had become a case study in how proper preparation, professional competence, and individual courage could combine to handle even the most serious emergencies successfully. The quiet heroism displayed by everyone involved had created a legacy that would influence aviation safety for years to come. Dr. Foster often thought about the coincidence that had placed her on that particular flight at exactly the right moment to help save a man's life. She had been traveling to present research about emergency medicine, never expecting to practice it at 37,000 feet. The experience had reinforced her belief in the importance of medical professionals being prepared to help wherever they might find themselves. As the ceremony ended and people began saying their goodbyes, Sarah realized that she had been part of a story that demonstrated the best aspects of human nature. The professional competence of the crew, the willingness of passengers to help, and the successful outcome had created a narrative of hope that would be remembered long after the technical details of the emergency were forgotten. The quiet woman who had slept peacefully in row 12 while a medical emergency unfolded around her had become part of an aviation legend. Her presence on Flight 447 had been coincidental, but her inclusion in the story served as a reminder that we are all connected to the heroic actions of others, even when we're not aware of them. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that happen around us while we sleep, trusting in the competence and dedication of others to keep us safe.